Welcome to the Dr. Diane Show, where we explore revolutionary expansion of mind, body, and soul with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. With over 20 years of expertise as a mindset warrior, perspective shifter, and unshakable optimist, I am dedicated to helping you reach your wildest dreams in business, health, performance, and relationships. Learn about the power of thought and how it shapes your life to take risks, change careers, find love, go on adventures, and live passionately with me, Dr. Diane. Get ready for revolutionary ways of thinking, being, and creating an amazing life. The Dr. Diane Show starts now. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Diane Hayden, and you are listening to the Dr. Diane Show on Transformation Talk Radio. Stay with us for the next hour where we will explore revolutionary expansion of mind, body, and soul. Each time on the Dr. Diane Show, we will have experts around the country discussing cutting-edge topics on longevity medicine, natural health, mindset, and soul purpose to help you shift your perspective and become a mindset warrior like me. I'm excited today to have Dr. Jared Skowron on with me. He's an international expert in autism recovery. He specializes in treating autism as a medical condition using natural therapies instead of pharmaceuticals. Dr. Skowron has worked with kids with autism for 20 years, helping them regain their speech, behavior, and independence. And I'm excited that he is one of our 10 best winners for our Natural Nutmegs 10 Best Awards this year as holistic pediatrician. So welcome, Jared. How are you today?
I'm great. Happy Thanksgiving. And thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah. Always a pleasure. We always have lots of interesting stuff to talk about for sure.
Yes, we could make this podcast forever.
So I always like to start with my guests with just giving our listeners and, people who are watching this a little bit of a background on how you got into what you do, like your specialty and, you're a naturopathic physician, and how you got into the whole, realm of working with children with autism.
Well, I'll tell you, I just kind of got fated into it. I think it was the calling that dragged me kicking and screaming, and I have loved every minute of it along the way. So when I graduated in 2003, which sounds like a long time ago now that you speak of it. Of course, as my daughter says, she says, "Dad, were you really born in the 1900s?" And I said, "Yes,
Right.
it was." So, my specialty right out of school was natural therapies for kids. So I came out kind of as a natural pediatrician, and that's where I wanted to go. And one of my first patients, my first year of practice, was severely autistic, and we weren't even taught autism back then. Again, that's the days when autism was 1 out of 250 kids. That's way less than 0.5% of our kids. And so I really didn't know what was going on. And she came in, and she was in a wheelchair. She's probably like 14 years old. And so she's in a wheelchair, and she had a G tube, and she wouldn't even look at me. She didn't know the difference between me and the wall. So she wasn't even in school. She was just kind of sitting at home, and the parents didn't know what to do. And eventually they're like, well, we can't take care of her forever. Eventually she's going to have to be in a home. So they came up to me and they said, "Hey, we need help." Okay. And this is way before autism became very popular on the scene. And again, I had no idea how to treat autism medically. Okay. But I knew how to treat neurological conditions naturally. And again, 20 years ago, this stuff was woo-woo, and now it's pretty commonplace. So we started with things like fish oil and B vitamins and magnesium. And those are 3 things that are great for practically any kind of neurological condition. So we were able to give her those things. And the next month she came in and she was looking at me instead of looking at the wall. And the next month she had some words and she was totally nonverbal. And the next month after that, they enrolled her back in school. So I was so set on fire that I could help this child knowing nothing. What if I could actually know something? And that just started my journey. And now I've helped thousands of kids with autism around the world. And I love it. And I love it because it can work.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So I want to get into a little bit of the numbers. I think most people who are in the autism realm, whether they have a child or they know someone or whatnot, this probably isn't surprising to them. But I think that for people who, everybody knows what autism is by now these days. But for people who are not in it, I think to hear what you're going to say about how many children have autism is going to be shocking.
Well, it is. And the crazy thing about these numbers, and I just looked them up on the CDC this morning just to see if there were any updates. The numbers now, and again, I mentioned when I got out of school, again, 20 years ago, was about 1 out of 250 kids. Now it's 1 out of 36. I mean, that is practically 3% of our kids. And there's a little statistical lag in that. And the statistical lag is the 3% diagnosis is kids who were born in 2012. So we're looking at kids who are 11 years old now. And most kids get diagnosed around, anywhere between 2 and 4 years old. Mm-hmm. So there are, even though today's number is about 3%, you're actually looking at the kids who are getting diagnosed now between 2 and 4. Those numbers are even higher. I think numbers came out of California. I want to say 1 out of 17 kids, or even boys at 1 out of 7. I mean, the numbers are creeping up to 5 to 10% of our kids are on the autism spectrum. It's huge, and it's only growing unless we intervene.
Yeah. Yeah. So why do you think this is? Why are these numbers skyrocketing like that?
That's a great question. Now, first off, I want to bust a myth. And one of the myths that is out there is that there's better diagnostics, there's better early intervention, there's more people looking at these groups of kids, and so more kids are getting diagnosed. And so that's kind of a write-off excuse that's out there. But please understand that is totally false. The numbers are increasing, and the people to ask, if you really want to know where these numbers are at, ask the teachers. Go and find a teacher who's been teaching for 20, 25 plus years and say, okay, how many kids do you have with developmental issues, behavioral issues now versus 20, 25 years ago? And they're the ones who are going to tell you. And look at the school budgets. I mean, the school budgets are being pushed so much with the amount of therapies and occupational therapy and speech therapy and paras that they have to provide for these kids. Those budgets are skyrocketing. And that's a whole nother issue about services that some kids get really well in affluent communities and kids in non-affluent communities really don't get. And it's a shame. Again, that's a whole nother topic not to get into, but that's the place. If you really want to know how these numbers are changing, ask the place where kids are, and that's schools.
Right, exactly. I mean, that right there would show you whether you were more believing along the lines of, oh no, now we just have better diagnostics and that's why we're seeing more of it. No, you're actually talking to the professionals who are working with these kids day in and day out.
Right.
But why do you think so like we've established, yes, they are skyrocketing. What is going on? Like what do you think is happening that's causing that?
Well, there's a lot of controversy about that. And let me say this, having treated thousands of kids over the years around the world, I have heard a lot of stories, and I've heard a lot of stories from families about this is when my child changed, and this is when I was concerned about their development because they weren't looking at me. They stopped talking. They stopped saying dad and mama. And so I've heard a lot from a lot of people. Okay. And there's really two areas who you can believe. You can believe the mothers who say, hey, I was with my kid and this is what I saw. Or you can believe, people who have a bias. And frankly, I believe the parents. So let me get into the 2 reasons I think autism numbers are increasing. And I talk about this with all of my families. There is no one cause for autism. There is no one cause for developmental delays. There are many, but the majority of them fall into 2 major categories. Okay. And there's some decent research that shows this. And I've kind of got some of this research in some courses and some lectures that I give. Number 1, some kids are born with genetic mutations or missing pieces of DNA called genetic deletions, where if you're missing a piece of DNA or a piece of DNA that makes the brain work is not functioning, okay, that is going to be the genetic cause of autism. This is something you are born with, okay? And that makes up about 1/3 of the cases. So there's research from Harvard that shows it makes up about 1/3 of the cases, research from Yale that shows it makes up 1/3 of the cases in boys and about 50% of the cases in girls. So the study just came out of Yale about 3 years ago, where I think it's 45%, not 50%, but 45% of girls diagnosed with autism have a genetic cause. That's where they were born. That's how their DNA was born. So that's kind of group one. And I want to get, I'll let me talk about that now since we're on it. Why so many more kids with genetic causes? Again, if we've gone from like 0.5% to 3%, we've doubled our numbers by 600%. Are we seeing, that many more genetic causes? And we are. And again, remember, a third of that six-fold increase is going to be genetic causes. And more kids are born with genetic mutations nowadays. Okay. And that's just where it's at. Okay. And I talk to a lot of families about genetics, and I talk to them, and there's a lot of myths about genetics. And a lot of the myths are, hey, you know what? I don't have autism, and my spouse doesn't have autism. And, Uncle Frank, he's a little weird, but he doesn't have autism. So how could this be genetic? And it's because the DNA is changing for the child. So again, DNA, half from mom, half from dad, you glue them together and there's the child. Sometimes, there's a little problem with a Xerox machine in there. At conception, the sperm meets the egg, and one of those pieces of DNA changes, okay? And that's where these genetic mutations come from. They're brand new. They're called de novo, brand new genetic mutations. Now, digging deeper down that rabbit hole of why that there are more missing pieces of DNA and genetic mutations that are causing these developmental delays, in my opinion, it's due to increased toxicity. And there's a lot of research in the animal world. It hasn't hit human world yet, but the more toxicity in certain areas, the more environmental poisoning and more environmental toxicity, you're seeing a lot of animals having genetic mutations. So there was a great research study about frogs who live near farms with a lot of pesticides. Those pesticides, if they get into the ovaries, they get into the testicles, there's a potential for changing that DNA. There's a potential for increased risk of these, again, missing pieces, mutations in the offspring in the animals. And frankly, it's such a toxic world now. This is where the research is showing this portion, this subset of kids, this is the genetic cause.
Yeah, it's really, it's scary, honestly. But I mean, it's also fascinating, when you think about, okay, and it's not just the parents. I believe also you could look back to grandparents, or maybe even further back to that, in terms of how DNA changes and things getting passed down. It doesn't even, like you're saying, it doesn't even matter whether or not somebody had this, disease or whatnot in the family history. Right. All these different things that your grandparents were exposed to. I mean, there's a whole field of study on this now called epigenetics, which really, to me, is just completely fascinating, that your grandmother, your great grandmother ate something or did something or was exposed to something that now affects you. And it's just wild.
It's crazy. There was something on social media the other day. They found lead in some baby formula. We think there's no toxicity, but it's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really is. And, like people who say, oh, well, why do we have to eat organic? My grandparents never ate organic and they were totally fine. My mother actually says some of this stuff to me. She's 89. And I'm like, Mom, you don't understand. You were not exposed to half of the garbage that I've been exposed to, my entire life. You probably had a good percentage of your life where things were pretty still clean and you didn't have to worry about, that kind of thing. But it's crazy, and it's something that we need to think about. So this is really fascinating. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the Dr. Diane Show with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. When we come back, we'll explore more with Dr. Jared Skowron. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back on the Dr. Diane Show with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. But before we continue, I want to make sure everyone knows how to contact me. You can find me at www.drdianehayden.com, or either of my two publications, www.naturalnutmeg.com and www.essentialnaples.com. And you can learn more about Dr. Jared Skowron at www.spectrumawakening.com. That's SPECTRUMAWAKENING.com. So welcome back, Dr. Skowron. We were talking about the children that were born with autism as a genetic situation. And then there's a whole nother side of it, which basically is children that are born, we think without any genetic issues, or pointing towards autism, and all of a sudden something happens?
Right. So let me kind of first, before I delve into this Pandora's box, how do you as a parent know? Say, hey, here's my kid, and I'm suspicious that something's wrong. Okay, and please trust that instinct. If somebody tells you no, just say goodbye and move on to somebody else, because nobody knows more about your child than the parents. Period. Okay, not your doctor, not grandma, you. All right. So if you're suspicious, hold on to that and talk to somebody. But again, these kids, and again, we'll say like about a third of the kids who eventually get diagnosed with autism are from a genetic cause. They're going to have developmental concerns from the beginning. Okay. And most kids with autism are good physical developers. Okay. They're crawling on time. They're walking on time. They're moving and throwing balls and kicking stuff and using silverware pretty much on time. So it's not that type of development, motor development. It's more cognitive development. It's more of the eye contact. It's more of the speaking. Okay. It's more of the sensory issues, covering their ears or only wanting certain foods or not wanting to wear their socks or even their clothes. So it's those kind of things that you're going to be watching for, especially the language and the eye contact in those early years. So if, let's say, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months comes along and all of a sudden, boy, this just does not seem right. I'm suspicious. Those are often more the kids that were born with these genetic issues. All right. So for those parents, I say immediately go get genetic testing. Okay. Whether that's with your pediatrician, your neurologist, your geneticist, whoever, we have genetic testing in our office. Get it done and see what it says. And again, here's another myth about the genetics. Most people think, oh, geez, if I got something genetic, I can't do anything about it. Well, so why even bother? And the reason is, and again, this came from the Harvard study I mentioned, 70% of genetic issues that cause autism are treatable. And that's a huge thing to really hold on to. You can't change your DNA. If you're born with cystic fibrosis, you have cystic fibrosis, and you always will. But there are things we can do medically to intervene to make your quality and quantity of life better. So we can treat genetic things to make your life better. All right. Can't cure it, can't change it, but we can make it better. Now, and those are the kids, again, that weren't developing as, that first 12 months of life. And I hear parents say a lot, geez, I don't want to compare my kids. And you do want to compare your kids. You don't want to judge them. You don't want to say, hey, he's better than she is, or she's better than he is. No, but we do want to compare them. That's how we know, is a child developing the right skills at the right age. And so we have to do that. So it's great
comparing with their other I was just going to say, comparing with their other siblings.
Exactly. And so you should do that. You should say, hey, you know what? This one at age 12 months was doing this, and you're not even close. Mm-hmm. So, we got to look into it. Just look into it. So let's go over to that other group. And that other group is about the 2/3 of kids, okay, where the genetics is the 1/3. This is the 2/3 that have regressive autism. Okay. And I want to pause on that term, regression. These are the kids where everything seems to be going fine. Okay. I'm making eye contact. I'm saying dada. I'm saying no. I'm saying mama. And then bam, gone. It just disappears. Sometimes in one day. Sometimes it might take a week or two, but all of a sudden there's a point in life where those cognitive skills that I had are all of a sudden gone. Okay. Motor skills are still there, but I'm not making the eye contact. I'm not looking at you. I'm screaming more. It's an obvious change in the development, and it's the wrong direction. It's backwards. So we call that regressive autism. So that's the second group. And again, to kind of get into why that happens with that second group, there's a lot of talk about different reasons, but if I go to the science, and I find this one really intriguing and something that pediatricians refuse to read science about, is that Tylenol, acetaminophen, or internationally paracetamol and Calpol, that is associated with autism. And there is a great research team, a combination of Duke and Harvard, that's published multiple studies about how it's all this Tylenol that actually, what the Tylenol does, it is an anti-inflammatory, but Tylenol will open the blood-brain barrier. So, and pharmaceutical companies now are combining brain drugs with Tylenol to get it into the brain more effectively. So we know that strong wall between the brain and the rest of the body is very strong. You got to keep stuff out of the brain that you don't want. That's opened up with Tylenol, with acetaminophen, with I can't remember the other one, Calpol and paracetamol. So if you have a lot of infections running around the body, okay, if you for some reason have viruses in your body, and all of a sudden you take a lot of Tylenol and it opens up that blood-brain barrier, those viruses could potentially cross over. And the reason we know this is because there's research that performs spinal taps and autopsies on children's brains. And guess what? The kids with autism, their brains have multiple live viruses. And kids without autism and adults, we don't have viruses in our brain, period. So we're putting the pieces together, all right? And it's really hard to kind of tell everybody in the world and every pediatrician in the world, stop using Tylenol, stop using acetaminophen, because there is no research on its safety for neurodevelopment. And the only research that's out there shows how toxic it is. So it's huge. So it's a combination of that and again, these infections, and it's rough. It's really rough.
Yeah, that's amazing because, everybody thinks Tylenol's safe. Like, you give it to your kids because you and I actually did another podcast, I think, where we talked about this, where you were saying, that was like the biggest recommendation that pediatricians would give to the parents before the children would come in for vaccines or whatever they had to, whatever they were doing. If it was going to be something painful, give them a Tylenol beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Every pediatrician across the world does it. Sorry, not every, but pediatricians all over the world, because I have patients in every continent. The pediatricians recommend this stuff, and it's everybody thinks it's safe. You can just go to the drugstore and buy children's Tylenol. Why would a country allow something to be sold if it would harm a child? And it honestly,
not going down that path.
well, the answer to most questions is money anyway, but they just never, Tylenol is such an old medication. They never did the safety studies on it. It would never. And I've got a good friend who's a Ph.D. chemist. And we got onto this conversation a few weeks ago. And he was like, Tylenol would never pass safety trials today. Never. It is such a toxic medication. It's so toxic. Every hospital has a poisoning antidote protocol if somebody overdoses. So why would I give my child something that could potentially be poisonous or toxic, and that I could take them to the hospital and every doctor in the world would know how to detox from Tylenol poisoning? Why would I give my child something like that when there's no research that says it's safe? The only research says it's potentially harmful. So why do it?
Yeah. So you mentioned Tylenol. Was there something else?
Well, again, it's Tylenol combined with viruses. Okay. Or other infections. We've got Lyme, we've got other tick-borne infections, we've got mold infections. So there's a lot of different infections that can kind of cross the blood-brain barrier when you have these infections or are given these infections, when you take Tylenol or acetaminophen or paracetamol. Then we do see some kids where it is an issue of certain things that are given that are toxic to their body, and they probably have some inherited poor detox pathway for certain things. And so there are a handful of my kids where they went to the hospital. They were 5, they were 6 years old, right? And they had to go in the hospital for some procedure, and they went in and they came out and they couldn't talk. And they were basically got autism at the hospital. Now, autism isn't contagious. So what medication or what infection did they contract or get there that all of a sudden this regression happened at such a late age? Because the majority of these regressions occur between 12 and 18 months of age. So if you have a kid where 5, 6 years old, something happens and you have a regression, you've got to look at what happened in that instance. So
yeah, it's so interesting because it doesn't happen to all children, right? It's like, some are more tolerant maybe, or didn't get as much Tylenol. It's just, that'd be the curious thing to me to investigate.
Well, you mentioned epigenetics at the beginning of the podcast, and I believe it's epigenetics on the glutathione genes, and it's the glutathione genes that detox acetaminophen. So if you can't detox it, it's just running around your brain, keeping that thing open to intruders. So again, that's a great question. Why some and not others? I do think it's some epigenetics on detoxification.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we understand now, the difference between being born with it, an actual genetic situation versus why a child might be fine up until age 4 or 5 or whatever. Oh, that was it. That was the other question I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Is there are you seeing more of an age thing? Like it either happens by age X, whatever that is, or typically you don't see it past a certain age.
That's a great question. I would say the majority of our kids are going to be these regressive kids. And these are the kids where, again, around 12 to 18 months, I can extend it to 24 months, especially kids who were born right before COVID, and that 12 to 18 month range came at the time where you couldn't go to your pediatrician. There's going to be a bump in that diagnosis age. But majority of the time, it's, I would say, between 12 to 24 months. Now, the genetic kids can be kind of from birth, something's off. If you've got that mother instinct, and you're like, something's wrong, go get it investigated, go see a geneticist, go get that testing done. But again, these kids who are regressive, I would say 12 to 24 months, but there are, again, some of the genetic conditions don't come on until like 3, 4, or 5. But the vast majority, I would say past 24 months, if you don't see anything, I wouldn't worry too much.
Yeah. So it's not a situation where typically you're going to have a child who's over 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever that all of a sudden develops this. That's probably pretty rare.
That's the super rare case. We've got way more things to worry about than that.
Right.
Or 5 and 6 years old.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. So this is fascinating. We're going to learn much more about what parents can do and other things that you've been able to do to help your patients in a couple of minutes. We're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, we'll be talking more with Dr. Jared Skowron. He's an international expert in autism recovery. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back on the Dr. Diane Show with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. I am talking today with Dr. Jared Skowron. You can learn more about him at www.spectrumawakening.com. That's SPECTRUMAWAKENING.com. And before we broke, we were talking about just how we can tell if a child has autism, whether it's something that they're born with, a genetic issue, or something that develops, within the first couple of years. And I think it's great, like you've said a couple of times, if a parent has any suspicion, definitely, talk to their pediatrician or find a holistic pediatrician, because as you said, the parents know the children better than anybody else for sure. So along that lines, what are some of the things that you recommend parents do to help their children with autism?
Well, let me talk about 2 things. And the first one is kind of piggyback on what you were just saying. Look, you as a mom, you as a dad, know your child better and have better instincts about them than anyone else. So if you think something is off, don't wait. Don't be in denial. Stubborn dads, do not be in denial about your child. You are there to help them, whether you want something to be true or not. Okay. And that's a tough nut to swallow. So you've got to go ask questions. Now, the first place to go is your pediatrician and say, hey, pediatrician, I think something's off. They're not talking. They're not looking at me. They were talking. And the goal is to get an early intervention assessment. Okay. Now, let me talk about early interventions. Then I'll go throw pediatricians under the bus. Every state in the country has a free assessment group to identify if your child is developing as they should. And this is free if your child is 3 years or younger. Okay, so the first 3 years of life, you can go to your state. You don't even need your pediatrician. You can go to your state, just Google early intervention and your state and call. Just you start calling, you start ringing that phone off the hook till you get an appointment. Now, the appointment's probably going to be a few months out, but get that appointment so they can come. They're the experts. They're the speech therapist. They're the occupational therapist. They're the behavior therapist, the physical therapist that can go in and say, hey, I look at kids all day long, and we're going to look at your kid, and I'm going to tell you, excuse me, if I think something is off or not. All right. That's what you do. Hopefully your pediatrician will have started that process for you. But if they didn't, you can call them on your own. So don't wait, just contact them and get on the list and get that assessment done. Okay. Let me go back to the pediatricians. If you have a pediatrician that brushes you off, go find a new one. Okay. Because I don't want to hear boys just grow slower. There's so many people in the house. That's why they don't talk. There's two languages in the house. That's why they're not talking, blah, 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 blah. Any kind of dismissive comment is a person not wanting to help you for whatever reason, period. Okay. They're dismissing you. They're not believing you. Okay. Go contact early intervention. Here in the state of Connecticut, it's called Birth to 3. Every state has a different name for this, but go reach out on your own. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, all right, what is the first thing you can do to help these kids? It's gonna sound overly simple, but you need to do it. Make sure they're pooping. All right, really simple. We take it for granted. Make sure they're pooping. All right, and let me walk you through the short story and the long story of that. Okay, number one, we all got to poop, right? Pooping is really important, and you want to make sure your kid, gets rid of a nice brown log every day. That's what you need. All right. If most kids with autism have constipation, constipation can look two ways. Constipation can look the classic way where you're grunting and you're straining, it's not coming out, and then it tears on the way out, and there's a little blood, or maybe you just get rabbit pellets. That's kind of classic constipation. The other kind of constipation that you get is that the body knows that there's a big poop up in there in the colon, and so it tries to flush it out. And so what you get like flushed out poop. You get these little piles. So you get a little pile, but you never get the whole thing. I mean, I remember when my daughter was young, she'd go poop. I'm like, that's bigger than mine. Where did you put that thing? All right. Look, poop's got to be big, and we've got to do it. Most kids with autism are constipated. Most kids with autism aren't pooping thoroughly and completely on a daily basis. Okay. And two things are going to happen. Okay. Number one, it hurts. It hurts a lot. You're constipated. It's pushing, it's moving, it's trying to move. A lot of kids withhold it because they knew it hurt before, so they're not going to let it out. That's going to cause a lot of pain, and that's going to increase their behaviors. So if you have these kids who are like just sitting there all fine, and then they start screaming, you're like, what? Why are they screaming? There's no reason. Man, that body's trying to poop, but it's not happening. Okay. It's not happening, or they're holding it in. All right. So a lot of our unexplained behaviors without a trigger is just a kid who can't poop. All right. The second thing, and I want the OTs to listen out there. Okay. Let me tell you what happens when I have to poop and I'm running to the bathroom. Oh, I'm going to be on my tiptoes the whole way trying to make it there. All right. All these kids that you see toe walking with autism, all right, they don't have tight calf muscles. They got to take a dump. So this, and I say this in a humorous way to get the point across, these kids aren't pooping, and you need to help them. Okay. In whatever way that works.
And it's so interesting. Why are they prone to constipation?
Has to do with mitochondrial dysfunction. So what happens is mitochondrial, there's this whole, I call it the domino effect. We talked about what caused autism, and that's the first domino, but there's so many different medical parts of the body that kind of get offset in autism. There's autoimmune issues, there's detoxification issues, there's brain chemistry imbalance, there's hormone imbalances, other stuff. And one of those dominoes along the way is mitochondrial dysfunction. And mitochondria produce energy for every cell of the body. Okay. Two parts of the body that need a lot of energy: the brain to develop, and muscles. And our colon is a big muscle. If we ever play charades at the next gala, this is pooping for charades. Okay. That colon's got a lot of muscle on it, and it's got to push that poop out. But if the muscles of the colon don't have the energy, because the energy, the mitochondria, the energy producers aren't functioning well, that's kind of this domino cascade that leads to poor GI, peristalsis, and constipation.
Right. Okay, makes sense. So you mentioned, the first thing is to get them to get evaluated. The second is to make sure they're not constipated, or just be aware of that. What's the third thing that parents can do?
Boy, I'll tell you. I would say number one, or number three, I've lost count already. I would say engage with them as much as you can. Okay. They're your child, and they're as smart as every other kid out there. Our society judges intelligence on this hole. Whatever comes out this hole, that's how smart I think you are. Okay. And so when people are nonverbal and kids are nonverbal, we assume, well, that there's nothing up there because there's nothing coming out here. And that's wrong. Okay. These kids are thinking and feeling just like you and just like every other kid. And they are in such fight or flight. Okay, these kids, and when you talk to people with autism who have become verbal, and kind of gotten through that, or I read this poetry, that kids with autism write and stuff, it all surrounds about the massive amounts of anxiety that they have. Okay, so anytime your child is freaking out and you've lost your sanity, right, because the screaming and you have no cortisol left, you've got to remember they're scared. They're scared. Okay, that causes all the sensory issues, that causes the hyperreactivity. Anything you can do to get yourself in that calm place and soothe them, they're petrified. They're scared. Okay, make them feel loved. There's nobody that can make them feel loved like a parent. So
yeah. I bet meditation is big. In fact, I was just at this retreat a couple of months ago, and one of the things that they were talking about was how meditation was really helping a lot of children with autism because it's reducing that just sensory overload.
Right. Yeah. And the sensory overload comes from all that adrenaline. Yeah. There's a story that I'll tell, when I'm lecturing. Imagine you're asleep. Okay. It's nighttime, you're asleep, and all of a sudden, bam, a window breaks in your house. Okay. Woo, you are on, and you can hear everything. You can feel everything. You're like hearing your own heartbeat because your senses are so dialed up because you're in fight or flight trying to stay alive. Okay. And and yeah, hey, you know what? I saw the rock or the tree limb, and that's what broke my window. Now my adrenaline fight or flight goes down. I'm calm again because I rationally understand my safety. But these kids don't. These kids are in that fight or flight, sensory overload, adrenaline, cortisol place where they can feel, hear, and see everything. Don't clip my nails. Don't cut my hair. Why do you want me to speak or do fractions or whatever you're trying to tell me to do? I'm trying not to die. So this is where those sensory issues come from. It's from the adrenaline overload.
Right. And the fact that they can't communicate sometimes at all or that well. So one thing you do is you help children recover their language. So how do you do that?
Great question. And again, there's a lot that we do. And when I talk to my families about, hey, what do you want? What are your goals? If I could do anything for your child, hey, I've been doing this for 20 years. What do you want help with? Number one is language, because most of these kids are nonverbal or pre-verbal or just, stimming different YouTube things. And there's so many, like I said, different medical things to push. We talked about infections. We talked about toxins. We talked about mitochondria. We talked about pooping in the gut, right? What I find changes most of the language is abnormal brain chemistry. Okay. And that sounds pretty big, but just to bring it down, to something everybody's heard. These are terms everybody's heard of. These are chemicals that our brain makes to make our brain function, right? And majority of kids are deficient in those. So for kids in my practice, I'll test them, right? We collect their urine, we send it to Quest or whatever lab, and they'll measure the levels of these chemicals in your brain. And they're often really deficient. And so what we can do naturally, because there is no pharmaceutical intervention for autism, okay? I wish there was something to help, but there's just not. If you can encourage a production of these brain chemicals, then all of a sudden the language comes out. So we know you are what you eat. We know the vitamins, the proteins, the carbs, the fats, the minerals, whatever, that make different parts of the body. Hey, we take calcium to make our bones grow. We know that, okay? And there are certain vitamins and proteins and such that produce brain chemicals, okay? And hey, we're recording this just after Thanksgiving, and most people ate some turkey and got tired and sleepy afterwards, and again, most people know this, but turkey's got tryptophan. And tryptophan is the protein that makes serotonin, that makes you happy. And tryptophan is the protein that makes melatonin, and that makes you sleepy. So, even in just kind of day-to-day life, we understand food affects my feelings. Okay, food affects my feelings because that turkey Thanksgiving meal made me happy and sleepy because we know how to make brain chemicals, because we know the nutrients that make them. So, well, I formulated this whole protocol line of supplements of different vitamins and proteins that produce brain chemicals, and that gets the brain to make more language.
That is awesome. That is awesome. We're going to touch more on that. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to the Dr. Diane Show with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. And when we come back, we'll be talking more with Dr. Jared Skowron. He's an international expert in autism recovery. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back on the Dr. Diane Show with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. If you want to learn more about me, you can find me at www.drdianehayden.com. And I am talking today with Dr. Jared Skowron. He's an international expert in autism recovery, and his website is www.spectrumawakening.com. And when we were just finishing up before this last break, we were talking about one of the ways that you help autistic children recover their language, and that is through just the brain chemistry in terms of giving them different supplements or things like that. So I wanted to just come back to that before we move on, and because I bet people are wondering, okay, wow, I never even thought about that. How do I know if there are imbalances in my child's brain and that's what might be causing it? And then where do they, what resources do you have for them with this?
Yeah. So let me kind of explain how I got from there to here.
Yeah.
Again, so I've been practicing for 20 years with these kids. And, what I would normally do is just suggest, hey, you should try these certain vitamins. I know these vitamins help with this, and these vitamins help with serotonin, and these vitamins help with dopamine, and these vitamins help with this brain chemical or the other. And it came to a point where, oh, hey, they come back for a visit and they'd say, hey, this is great. My kid's talking more and they're happier and our house is calmer. But I feel like a pharmacist because I got all these 20 bottles here. And frankly, it's pain in the butt. And I want to do it. It's for my kid, but can you make it any easier? And that kind of snowballed into me creating and formulating my own supplements specifically for my patients. And so this is where Spectrum Awakening was born. So again, I've been practicing for 20 years. Spectrum Awakening is the autism vitamin supplements that I created for my kids. We're actually going to celebrate our 10th anniversary in 2024, which is awesome. So we've been around for 10 years. And it's, my goal was to put all these things together in something that was decent tasting, which is half of the problem, gluten-free, dairy-free, and try to make everything a powder. So I wanted to make sure that my patients had the best things for their kids. So this is kind of how it came to be. And again, what we do is we basically put the different nutrients that the brain needs. People say, well, I'm giving my kid a multi. Well, that's great. But, the only thing that multivitamins are designed to do is to prevent scurvy and prevent nutritional deficiency diseases. They're not enough nutrients for health. Okay. They're designed to be the bare minimum. Right. So we want to make sure we're getting the right nutrients in the right amounts for the brain to make the chemicals that it needs to develop. And so we've been formulating different things, over the past decade to really make these kids' brains work well. And again, I made this stuff for my patients and for my families. It's available to everybody now, on our website. You don't have to be a patient, but I've been able to change it and improve it year after year after year after seeing how it works with our kids. Like, okay, hey, you know what? With our kids, we may need a little more of this, or we need a little more of this. And so again, we've created, we'll just call them brain vitamins. They're the vitamins the brain needs. And what you're going to see is more talking, a happier child, a child without as many sensory tantrums or reactions, not as much hyperactivity, bouncing around, using your couch as a jungle gym, or screaming every time they take their tablet away, or maybe you are done co-sleeping with them. I mean, I've got 14-year-old boys who are still co-sleeping with mom, and maybe you don't want that anymore. So this is how it's all kind of developed, and it's great because it works, and I love watching it work. I mean, that's why I do this.
Yeah, that's awesome. What about other resources to learn more? I know you have an ebook, you have some
Right.
podcasts. So where do you want to send people?
Yeah. So if you want to learn more, and I'm trying to develop the different levels of education that I've got. And again, I started, here's my practice, come on in, let me help you. And then we branched off to Spectrum Awakening, where anybody around the world can get these supplements and get different lab tests. We've got lab tests on our website as well. And I'm trying to increase our education. So we've got a couple different levels of things. Number one, we've got a free ebook. So there's a free ebook, Beginner's Guide for Autism. And, download that free ebook on our website, take a look through. It kind of talks a lot about what we just discussed on the podcast, talks about the genetic stuff, talks about the Tylenol, it talks about the constipation and the toe walking. And then it gets into this vitamin protocol that I've got to help my kids with speech. So that's kind of level one. Level two is I've got a video course. So the video course is a fee. I think it's $75, and it's gonna more walk you through these things in detail and give you all the scientific research. So I think that course has 50 different scientific studies that you're going to be able to download and say, okay, I see this guy talking, but I want to see it myself. And this is where we've got the hard science in that course. And then the next level is to really book an appointment with me. And so, I have telemedicine visits. You sit on your computer, you sit on your phone, I'm here, you're there. And again, I talk to families around the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. And all the resources are amazing for sure. So, and everyone can find that at spectrumawakening.com.
Right.
So we just have a few minutes before we finish up. I want to know, what is your favorite story of autism recovery?
Well, there are a lot of fun stories that I have, that you just kind of remember for your whole life. One of them was at a conference. So I was at an autism conference. I think this was 2019. It was right before COVID hit. 2019 down in Atlanta. And we were there Friday to Sunday. And on Friday, a mom came up to me and she said, hey, I've got this kid and she's 4 years old and she's nonverbal and, autism. And we talked and, how can you help? And, I said, you know what? There's all these different subsets of kids and how they present. I think yours would do really well on this brain vitamin. So we had a brain vitamin and that fit her child. I said, this sounds like it'll work. Okay, that was Friday, right? 4-year-old, nonverbal. There we go. Sunday comes around 2 days later. And I'm standing, standing in the hallway and she's coming up and she sees me and she stops. And I look at her and she looks at me and she starts tearing up and I start tearing up. And she comes over and I'm like, how is she? And she said, today's my birthday. And before I left to come to the conference, my daughter pulled me down. So I kneeled down in front of her and she held my face and she hasn't talked in 2 years. And she said, happy birthday, Mom. And that is what it's all about. I mean, we want our kids to have a great life and, we love them. And to know that you can get your child back is what is so important for parents to understand, that there is hope. And maybe your pediatrician doesn't know what to do, and that's okay. They were never taught. And maybe family members tell you to just forget about it and stop trying to help your child. But you can. You really can do stuff for your child.
That's amazing. That is amazing. What should every parent remember if they have a child with autism?
Well, again, just repeating what I just said is that there is hope. Okay. There is hope out there to help your child. This word has not traveled far yet. Okay. Because your pediatricians are probably going to say, this is dumb. You're wasting your money. Don't hurt your kids. Stop Googling ways to help your child. Just send them to therapy, go to speech and go to OT. Okay. And that's what the typical conventional pediatrician is going to say. And you may get that same kind of poo-poo from family members or friends or neighbors, and you feel alone and you feel like you're on an island. But trust me, connect with other autism families. There are autism support groups around the country. Get together with your tribe. Okay. Get together with people going through what you're going through, because there are things we can do. Okay. And we, even I just reached out to the autism group in my town and they're like, what? You do what with what? I'm like, you can help these kids. We've seen it. So just believe and never give up on them.
Yeah. Yeah. It is amazing. I mean, and there are so many things. I mean, think about all the things we talked about today on this podcast. It's like, there are so many things that you can do, and you are a wealth of resources for sure. I mean, people should absolutely check out your website. Again, it's www.spectrumawakening.com, and download the free ebook. Check out your course, your speaking. That's one of the questions I was going to ask you. At a lot of these conferences, are they just professional, or they're open to lay people as well?
There's a lot of lay people conferences out there. One that I talk at a lot is called TACA, TACA. That's a great one. It's out in California every October. I'll be lecturing at a family conference in Texas this February. I believe it's called Autism Research Summit. But I think it's somewhere in Texas in early February. And I've got a podcast with over 100 episodes. And if you really want to know more stuff, every Thursday on our Facebook page, our Spectrum Awakening Facebook page, I do a Facebook Live, which is where I record the podcast. So I record the podcast live. People ask questions in the comment section, and we have a conversation for an hour, and it's great. And, chime in with your tribe.
Yeah, that is so awesome. Well, I appreciate all the great information. Dr. Skowron, thank you so much for joining us. And again, people can learn more about you at www.spectrumawakening.com. Thanks for being on our show.
Well, thanks for having me, Diane. It's always fun.
Of course. And I want to thank all of you for tuning into the Dr. Diane Show. Please join me the first and third Thursdays at 11 Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. Next time on the show, we'll be discussing more about the power of thoughts and beliefs and the impact they have on your life. Have a great week, and I'll see you back here next time. Thank you for tuning into the Dr. Diane Show, revolutionary expansion of mind, body, and soul with me, Dr. Diane Hayden. Tune in every Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern on transformationtalkradio.com. Center your thoughts on what you want and shut the door on every suggestion of fear, worry, or lack from your own consciousness or the consciousness around you. Once you master that, everything is possible. To learn more about me, Dr. Diane, and receive a free digital subscription of my magazine, visit naturalnutmeg.com.